Hey everyone, so now that we've seen the basics of Voronoi, let's talk a bit more about it. Theoretically, you can skip this video if you want because you know everything you need for RBDs, but I felt like Voronoi is such an important tool and so powerful that I want to show you a bit more around it. Because, for example, what you can use Voronoi for is modeling, actually. So even if you don't want to use it for RBDs, it's a pretty nice tool to have once you play around a little bit with it. So, for example, as we've seen, it needs points. So a normal scatter gives you kind of uneven, cracks and variations. And of course, if you make sure that your points are less even, then the result will be less even. That's what we saw in the last video. Now, for modeling, it can be interesting, though, that you use very even distributions in your points to then create very even results. For example, if you create a circle, and this already shows you it doesn't have to be only points. You can use normal polygon geometry as long as it has any points. And you use that as an input. What comes out of it is this kind of shape. Because of course, what happens here is it takes the points and they build the center of a single shard, so to say here. And what's interesting now is you could use a copy and transform, for example. And this is really just me, playing around. So to give you some ideas what you can do with it. And if you copy that a couple of times, maybe like this, what you get is this kind of shape based on the input points. And I just want to show you, okay, interesting, you can actually create certain topologies with it that might otherwise be pretty hard to create. Then also keep in mind, you can always noise up stuff that you put in. So for example, you could add a noise to the position, and by adding an amplitude to it, and in this case, I think making sure that the values are zero centered. Yeah, so it's plus and minus. You can break this up. And maybe here you can see it could look a little bit like, a tiled base of a garden or whatever, something like that. So this is what I use it very often for, to kind of create man-made but yet somewhat natural shapes. Another example in the same direction is you can use that to very evenly break up objects. For example, by using the points from volume node that creates a grid-like structure in the points. So as usual, we can't turn off the guide here in the points from volume. So I create a null so that we can look at the points by themselves. And we know that. And if we use that now as an input for Voronoi, then we can see, if we use an exploded view, for example, there you go, that we can break up our toy here in box-like shapes. So actually, let's make the point separation higher so that our boxes are bigger. And here you can see it. I mean, the normals are broken now. That didn't help. I think it's just the color got lost. Okay, that's fine. But you get the idea. So you can break up something in boxes, so to say. And maybe, that's something that you need for something, for an effect or whatever. And this is kind of just interesting to remember that the Voronoi fracture allows you to do that. In the same direction again, you could actually use that for a simple box or a longer box, for example, and use the same technique. So let's just copy the whole thing over. And what you get, of course, is again a grid-like box distribution. In this case, actually, let's lower the distance again. And the cool thing now is that you can, in the points from volume, use the jitter scale on top, just like we did with the noise. And you can noise the whole thing up just a little bit. And this is what I meant before for creating man-made yet natural structures. An example for this would be some kind of wall. I mean, what you can't do is a staggered wall. I actually tried that with Voronoi, and it's not really useful for that, unfortunately. They will always be kind of on top of each other, unfortunately. But nonetheless, this is kind of interesting. And if you go a bit further, an idea here would be that this could mimic wall that was made in the, 12th century or something, where they just took natural materials. So in other words, for example, a castle or something like that could be built with a structure like that. And this could be a relatively easy way of creating this. For example, since those objects are now separated, they're not just, you know, broken up, but they're actual pieces by themselves, you could use a subdivide to subdivide them afterwards to kind of soften them up. And here you can see what I'm talking about. You get the look of a stone wall. I mean, this is a bit too soft, but what you can do is you do 2 steps. You do a subdivide that only creates additional subdivisions without softening it, and then you take that as an input of a subdivision, and then it looks like this. So yeah, you can see here, this is a pretty good example. Looks a bit like a stone wall relatively quickly. And then I'm finishing this example, but I kind of like it. Instead of a subdivide, you could of course only just use a polybevel, which is a bit less aggressive and a bit more kind of sharp, let's call it. And then it could look like this. Unfortunately, it can create problems, so you have to be a bit careful. And I kind of forgot how to do that. I think here, yeah, I think that was the way of doing it. So if you are careful with the settings to make sure that your bevel is not too aggressive, then you can kind of fix those problems. So both options are there, and you can see you can create rock-like structures relatively quickly. Okay, great. So, and you could then of course simulate this as well. And then finally, I want to show you a technique that kind of uses that a little bit to create a particular Voronoi shape that is very useful for wood. And we will actually use that later on. This one is pretty important. If you look at how wood breaks, it kind of splinters. So the pieces are not, you know, spherical in nature, but more very long because of the way wood grows. Now, how do you do that? If you take, let's say, a tube to simulate some kind of wood stem, of course, we turn it into a polygon, end caps, make it a bit smaller but longer. There you go. And of course, you have the problem now, even if you use volume to scatter the points inside, you will always have something that feels a little bit like, and I think you can instantly tell, I feel like, okay, this is now made of concrete, for example. And that is because of the shape of the pieces. And there's actually no good way of making them long inside of this setup. You can try different things, but it will not work. Here's an interesting trick that is around for quite some years. You can just scale the input that goes in down in Y. So we just push our log down, and then we scatter inside of that, split this up, and then and for now I do it in the least elegant way. I just multiply it by 10 back, and then if we create more points, you can see it even better. You basically get long points. So with an exploded view, you can see much better what I'm talking about. Here you have it. Maybe this time it was a bit too many points, something like that. And I think we can agree that feels a lot more like wood. Actually, 0.1 is usually not enough, even though it's, you know, a division of 10. But before we change that, let's actually make sure that this transform and this last transform are connected, so that I don't have to manually always do that. The first way of doing it is just taking the first number and create an expression here by pasting it to the back scaling at the end, and just divide 1 by the number that goes in this first scale, because 1 divided by 0.1 makes 10. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is you just take your transform node, and you can do that. I'm not sure actually where the menu for this is. I'm sure if you look for it, you can find it, but you can create a clone of this basically. So a node that is connected to the old node with every parameter. And you do this by clicking Control, Shift, and Alt, and then drag your node. And what you can see is all the parameters are now referenced to the original one. Why would I do that? Because it has an invert transformation option here. And if I just right click and then delete the connection and click that on, then I basically have something that is completely inverting whatever I did in the first one, because they both are connected, and you can actually even visualize that with your dependencies view. So what I often do to remember that I did that, I give them both the same color. Okay, and the advantage of this now is that I can use lower numbers and it will automatically adjust itself to it. So maybe 0.04 and maybe a few more points. And of course you could put this into an asset if you want. And now you can see we have kind of wood-like splinters. And let me quickly, just to prove that, put this into an RBD bullet solver and transform it up a little bit so that we can actually see it fall. And then of course I have to activate the ground in my bullet solver. And if I run this now, you should be able to see the idea quite clearly. There you go. Maybe the pieces are a bit too long. Let's shorten them a little bit. But this is the nice thing about this technique. You can always change the length with a single number. And here you can see you have kind of wood-like pieces that fall down and break. Yeah, so this is a technique we will use later on. There are other techniques, of course, but this is kind of an old school, very fast and very easy to understand way, understandable way of doing this. And we will look at other ways, but I still feel those techniques are completely still valid nowadays, especially for simple stuff, something's in the background, for example. And I will still use that in an example because it's so damn fast and easy to control. So yeah, as you can see, a lot of interesting techniques that you can use with Voronoi. And yeah, I hope this was helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.